Here's video response number 1 to the radicant. There's a lot of things I think that I could talk about, but I'm going to just touch on a couple things that I thought were really interesting from the reading and try and keep my video pretty short. I'm going to start with the definition of radicant. To be radicant, it means one roots are in motion, staging them in heterogeneous contexts and formats, denying them any value as origins, translating ideas, transcoding images, transplanting behaviors, exchanging rather than imposing. The part about the definition that I think kind of struck me as really interesting is where it talks about our roots being in motion. And one of the reasons I think that it struck me as being interesting is what he says on page 82 is he's talking about our identity, and he writes that the Times point to an identity in motion, a fragile identity, an identity that is no longer the only solid foundation of individual and social existence as it was for modernity. And so he's talking about this idea that our identity is in flux and it's in motion and it can change. And one of the reasons that I really thought that was interesting was a book that I read last semester called The Future of Self. And the book basically talked about the ways that we form our identity and is changing because the world is changing so much. And so one part of this book that I think really relates to the radicant and what he's saying is the author talks about sort of like some of the fathers of psychoanalysis and psychology, Jung and Freud, and how they discuss like the prescription for mental health was to have an identity that was whole and integrated and coherent, and sort of like all of the pieces of who you were fit together and made sense. And that was what those men basically said was, you know, the way to happiness and health. And in the book he says that that consensus, that theory has unraveled in our postmodern world. And he says, many psychologists now claim that the way to health and happiness in today's decentralized, pluralistic world is to be decentralized and pluralistic. He says, the happy, healthy human being wears many masks. And he goes on to say, if stable societies need stable people, then fast-changing societies need fast-changing people. And so I thought it was just interesting that the same thought was echoed in this book, and it is an interesting thing to think about the way that we our world is changing. The times that we live in drastically affect the kind of people we are and how the kind of people we're becoming. And that was one of the things I wanted to touch on. The other thing I wanted to touch on was I'm taking this directed readings class with Allison Fields, and the class is about mythology, these vast narratives, and it's really interesting. The first book that I read in the class was The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell's his thing that he taught was called the monomyth, and it was just basically the theory that there's one story that appears throughout the world, and it doesn't discriminate on culture or geography or race or anything like that, and it's these major vast narratives that basically are the same. The structure, the heroes, the way that the story plays out, it's very, very similar, and there could be slight variations to the story, but he calls it the monomyth. It's one story. So that's what he taught. Now on page 104 of the Radicant, he says, one might justifiably wonder if the true master narrative of our era, the presence of which is so blinding we fail to perceive it, is actually this, that there is not and can no longer be any master narrative. Now, obviously, in the Radicant, he's saying that the master narrative of our time is that there can no longer be a master narrative. And the reason I thought that was really interesting was Joseph Campbell, in the conclusion of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, he says basically the exact same thing. He says that consciousness can no more invent or even predict an effective symbol that can foretell the future. There's one thing we may know, namely that as the new symbols become visible, they will not be identical in the various parts of the globe. The circumstances of local life, race, and tradition must all be compounded in the effective forms. Therefore, it is necessary for men to understand and be able to see that through various symbols the same redemption is revealed. Basically, I should have maybe just summarized that, but Joseph Campbell, in his conclusion to The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which basically says there's one story the world over, in his conclusion he says that as time unfolds and our stories begin to change, that one of the things that we will see is that as the world is changing, there will no longer be one story that works. And it's interesting because Joseph Campbell wrote this book like 30 or 40 years ago, and The Radicant was just written like 1 or 2 years ago, and they're saying the same thing, that the one master narrative for the world will no longer work because our world has changed so much. And I don't really have anything to add to that at all, but you will find that I am constantly trying to make connections between things, and there's sometimes it takes me a while to understand what those connections mean, but there's obviously a strong connection here in that Joseph Campbell is saying the same thing that the guy that wrote The Radicant is saying, separated by 40 years or so. And so I think that's interesting. I'm trying to keep these little videos short, so that's all I have to say.